Hi, and welcome back to Animals 2 by 2, where we take a week-long look at different animals. Today is day 3 in our week-long lesson. Lessons and objectives for this week is at the end of the week, I would hope that you can observe the structure and behavior of redworms, those little earthworms. Observe the structures and behavior of the nightcrawler, big earthworms. Compare how redworms and nightcrawlers are alike and how they are different. I want you to be able to communicate your observations of the structures and behaviors of earthworms. Make observations of the natural world and know that those are descriptors collected using your five senses. Remember, since we're distance learning, we're using the sense of sight and the sense of sound. That's your eyes and your ears. And really thinking it through and how you could use your other senses in different ways. I want you to be able to raise questions about the natural world. Use appropriate reference material that support your understanding and to obtain information by identifying the source. And that way you can really communicate those things to others more appropriately. Okay, so what you'll need is just some pencils, crayons, markers, or a pen, really whatever you feel comfortable using. A piece of paper to take notes or draw pictures. I find that if you're taking notes throughout the week, by the time we get to the comparing stage, it just makes things so much easier for yourself. And if you're drawing pictures, it makes it easier for you to share what you've learned with others, like your family members or your friends. And then we use the book Animals 2 by 2 earlier in the week when we read about the worms. Okay, so some vocabulary we've talked about so far is a burrow, which is a hole or a tunnel dug by small animals. In this case, we're referring to the worms. Um, Typically, you'll hear it when you're talking about rabbits and things like that, but actually, these earthworms have a burrow as well. Redworms. Redworm is just a red earthworm. It's used in composting kitchen waste and as fishing bait most commonly. Segments. It's just really each part into which something is or may be divided. And we've talked about segments on the redworm or the earthworm about how their body is segmented. Earthworm. It's a burrowing worm that lives in the soil. Earthworms play a very important role in aerating and draining the soil and burying organic matter. I know a lot of us have a stigma about worms and they think they're dirty and they're gross, but really they are just an amazing animal to have in the garden and outside because they really take waste and create this rich soil for us to use. So this week, once again, our investigation is on big and little worms. So we've got our little red worm and our European night crawler in the picture here, but we're going to just talk about the broad spectrum of night crawlers. Um, so as we go through, please feel free to take notes, draw pictures. Like I said over and over, that really does help us when we get to the comparing stage. So you can refer back to those things and it just really refreshes your memory and it helps you explain it better to others. Caring for earthworms. Luckily, earthworms are a way easier pet to have than, let's say, a dog, a cat, chickens, fish. These are incredibly easier to care for and they're a hardier animal. Easier to care for themselves and not as easily harmed as some of the other things that we have discussed and that you have learned about. Okay, so caring for your earthworm. The red worm and nightcrawler can be kept in a small terrarium if you'd like to have them at home. The soil should be moist, but without any pools of standing water. You can even use a spray bottle on the surface of your terrarium once a day or so and lay a sheet of clear plastic wrap loosely over the lid of the terrarium to maintain a moist environment. You don't have to dechlorinate the water like we had to do with our goldfish and snails. You can just use what you're going to use in that terrarium. You can add the soil to a small amount of oatmeal for food or add that to the soil. You can lay a few decaying leaves on the surface of the soil. If you keep a few dead leaves on the surface of the soil, the environment stays moist, and you'll often find that whether you have your redworms or night crawlers on the surface of the soil when you lift up the leaves, it's because your redworms will burrow more, like these here. They're going to be in the ground more than you'll see with the night crawlers, and we'll talk about those later. But it's often difficult to observe them without digging. So that's the problem. We're looking for those type of worms. You'll be able to see more in your terrarium by covering up with black paper for a day or so. The worms are sensitive to light. So when you do that and you take the paper off, then you can actually see the worms better because they're not going to be hiding as much. Uh, if you're using an earthworm observation terrarium, like in a class setting instead of just at home to have a pet, you can observe through the container, and it's really thin so that you can kind of see them moving like this one here. But when earthworms burrow, one wall of the burrow should always be on that clear side. It makes it easier to see, and you can watch the worms crawl through their burrows and really see that they move all the way through. But remember, it's going to be really important when you're caring for these worms to keep mixing the soil to keep it rich in nutrients. And it's really important because that's a function for the earthworm, is to mix up the soil as well, like doing the burrowing and going through. If you layer the soil and even sand in a terrarium, you can watch the mixture of the two materials as that worm burrows. Earthworms are fairly sturdy creatures, but you still have to handle them with some care, just because it is a living thing. So you should never tug, pull, or drop them. If a earthworm becomes severed or cut, it can regenerate. So don't throw it away. Put it in a separate container of moist soil and just watch what happens. These really are amazing creatures. Other things, like we saw in the video, that you can give them when you're composting leftover vegetables, like if you're cooking, that those extra parts of your dish, you can always throw those in there, and they are going to eat them up. Typically, you shouldn't have food in there for longer than a week, depending upon how many worms you have in there. They'll eat it rather quickly for their size compared to the amount of food that you put in there. So, redworms, very easy to care for. You just want to keep some moist soil, low light if you can. If you have a terrarium or an observation terrarium, that is amazing because it lets you really observe that creature in its natural habitat. Stay tuned tomorrow where we'll come back for lesson 4 and we're going to do some more investigating with worms. That's really where we're going to take a look at the night crawlers, and those are super cool. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you guys.